Sunday between 2 and 4 is a seasonal song fest at 3021 Winona Way. It is a very joyous time, all kinds of loving people and all kinds of goodies. Our next class will be February 10th because I'm going to be doing all of that stuff in California. Now, this will not be our first talk on Julius Caesar. We have, too bad Bill isn't here. He's responsible for this entire talk, and he didn't show up tonight. We have something hanging over from last meeting. When we were discussing the reform of Leontes, Bill suggested or averred very strongly that he didn't think Leontes had reformed at all, and that if he were given similar circumstances, that he would revert to the same kind of behavior. And Bill seemed to be speaking from knowledge and experience, and since he is a counselor, it seemed worthy to reconsider the whole play in this light. But I couldn't do it then because I'm a very slow thinker and I can't do things like that on the fly. So I thought about it over the 2 weeks and came up with all kinds of material. We're going to do hardly anything with the play. We're just going to discuss the issue that Bill brought up and allude to the play a little bit. It was a really fruitful topic. And so what we're going to do is deal with the whole idea of reform of character. And what we're going to do is probably going to be a little bit convoluted, as if that never happens with me. And it'll have many epicycles. So the way I place the question to my consciousness is, do we ever reform? And if we do so, how is it accomplished? And when do we know that we are reformed? We'll start with the way we treated the early Leontes in the early part of these talks. We originally said that the character of Leontes was a pathologically introverted character. Very seriously introverted person. It brings up another topic which I didn't have time to go into, but I've been thinking on it for a number of years, and sometime I want to talk about it, and that's the difference between pathological psychology and evil. Because every evildoer is pathological psychologically, but every person who's pathologically in trouble is not necessarily an evildoer. And so sometime I'd like to go explore that, but that may have to wait for a number of years since we don't have in any of the plays that we're going into, we don't have any real fiendish characters. But at any rate, psychologists such as Carl Jung would say that there is a great difference between introversion and an introvert. Introversion is a form of psychological activity. An introvert is a type. And that's where the whole problem is found. Both psychology and mysticism claim there are two streams of consciousness. One stream of consciousness whereby we experience facts in the external world and get impressions and thoughts, and we bring them all the way into the spirit, and the spirit forms intuitive conclusions about those facts. That is the introvertive stream. The extrovertive stream starts with intuitions or creative impulses or spiritual assertions, and it extroverts the same through the process of thoughts and emotions and the whole business. So it's something that we all experience. Both streams are necessary to our spiritual health. The spirit feeds on external facts from a different realm of its own, and it needs contact with the world. On the other hand, with our consciousness focused in the material world, need spiritual meaning. And so if there is not an extroversion, a constant outpouring that we receive from the Spirit, our lives dry up pretty quickly. So it's something that we both, we experience both of them. Both mysticism and astrology and psychology find that it is very necessary to have unimpeded flows, both from within out and from without in. In fact, I would go so far as to say that if there is a break in the stream such that the spirit cannot get all the way through to the personality, or the personality is not in touch with the spirit, that constitutes a perfect definition of insanity, because there is no connectedness. So it's important to keep the flow going and not to be fixed on one end of the flow or the other end. That is to say, if we become fixated outwardly on things, we tend to identify ourselves with things and get fixed in externality as the reality. If we turn inward and in that inwardness become fixated or locked, we are then frozen into a type. Carl Jung says that an introvert, I'm learning the English of this. It is introversion, but when it becomes a type, it is an introvert. At least that's the way they put it in all the psychological studies. The same thing with extroversion and an extrovert. The Carl Jung, who has written the most about introversion and extroversion, says that an introvert or an extrovert is one who prefers one end of these streams to the detriment of the other, and gets so set on that end that the person or that the one is associated or identified with either the outer personality or the inner individuality to the neglect of the other end or the other part of the character. So it is important not to become hardened, but to remain psychologically and spiritually pliable. Now, Carl Jung chose to define or to describe all of the characteristics of the introverts and extroverts relative to objects in the external world. That is like for a piece of lemon pie, an extrovert would revel in the lemon pie and think that that was the meaning of life. And the introvert would be one who would say that the piece of lemon pie is a temptation and it distracts and good evening. That's all right. Like the smile. Seem to be in a really great place. So then the relationship to the external object is the way that Jung and most psychologists define character, whether one is introverted or extroverted. It could have been just as well defined according to the internal subject. Jung chose to work with the external object because all of our science, material science, is extrovertive. It's all based on the reality and objectivity is in the external world. And Jung chose not to base it on the internal subject, and perhaps wisely so, because he saw a lot of subjectivism in being inward. And also he probably chose that stance because if he based everything on the internal subject, it would be too much like mysticism, and he was doing everything he could to avoid being associated with mysticism. Ultimately, if one turns in sufficiently and clarifies the inner consciousness, there is probably more objectivity in introversion than there is in extroversion. Because if we look at the apparently objective science that is extrovertive and materialistic, there's never any certainty in it. Because it might fail on the next case. And no matter how closely you measure and compare notes, you only have a pseudo-objective measurement of the world, because something always comes along and shows that your views are subjective nonetheless. And for all of the supposed objectivity of extroverted material science, there is less agreement between people within the same discipline, to say nothing of between disciplines, than there is among mystics. Because mystics separated by many, many centuries and by totally different cultures find much more unity, because they have associated themselves, or they've associated their consciousness with the spiritual unity that permeates everything, and from that a total objectivity is possible. So mysticism can be carried beyond, can take introversion and carry it beyond subjectivism and come to a very high degree of extroversion, a high degree of objectivity. Now, Carl Jung would say that an introversion as severe as that of Leontes, especially being pathologically, would definitely be a fixated, and it would definitely be a type. It would not be something, a character that had a lot of fluidity about it at all. Being a materialist and believing in one incarnation only, Carl Jung would be likely to believe that the type of someone like Leontes could not be changed. That once an introvert, always an introvert for all of life. And he did believe, however, in the value of counseling and of insight, so he would probably believe that he could correct the pathological part of the introversion so that Leontes was no longer sick-minded, but he probably couldn't reform him from being an introvert altogether. even in terms of mysticism, that if we have built our whole personality from one archetype, the idea of changing the personality so radically that it would not be set into an introvertive type would require a much greater overhaul than most people are capable of. So there would be some common agreement between psychology and with spiritual philosophy or with mysticism about the curability of Leontes in total. Jung never said specifically, to my knowledge, and I've read about 30 to 40% of everything Jung wrote, he never said that one could be freed of a type. And he never even said, he seems to imply that it isn't even possible that one can have a balance between introversion and extroversion. He seems to state that it isn't even possible to have a balance between the four functions, intuiting, thinking, feeling, and sensing in the material world. From the viewpoint of mysticism, the fact that our minds, our desire bodies, and our physical etheric bodies, as well as the spirit, are in different ages of development, it seems very unlikely that there can be a complete and perfect balance, except for someone who has gone and completed the entire character, someone like an adept who has developed each of the functions in the makeup of the human being to its full capacity and is capable of working with them. Mystics claim that becoming fixed or typed is one of the consequences of our fall into materialism. We have become sensorially dependent, and we set ourselves in a rebellion against heaven, so to speak. So even though the origin of our fixity is in seeing this world where objects seem to be very solid and very unchanging, the attitude of taking for granted or assuming that these things don't change, we have skewed our whole character so much that any of our functions, not only the perceptive function, but the emotional function, the thinking function, probably not the intuiting function, can become set or fixed just by habit. So it's a difficult problem. It is only a misperception of the physical world that gets us into this in the first place. If we had a truer or a deeper or a clearer perception, as the perception from the ethers, which is live viewing, we would see that even the apparently hard stuff of this world is itself quite fluidic. And if we got into the spirit, we would realize that the spirit is exceedingly dynamic. There is a constancy in the spirit, but there is not a fixity in the spirit. If we try to probe more deeply into the subject of how we become fixed and typed into introversion and extroversion, it gets a little bit more difficult. For example, if we try to find a motive or a rationale for being stuck in introversion, as Leontes is, we could say that it might be a reaction to insecurity. if we note this, especially in children that are insecure try to manipulate the world around them and have it set just the way they want it set. And in that way, they try to assuage their insecurity because they're in control of everything around them. In fact, they show extreme hysterical conditions if their little world gets upset. In fact, most of us do if our little world gets upset. That view of anxiety or insecurity and manipulation would answer to the definition or to the compact between Faust and Mephistopheles. When the deal is that Mephistopheles gets Faust's soul whenever Faust says, "Let this moment live forever." And so when we are insecure and we live in fear, we have sold our soul to the devil, so to speak, because we want things in a fixed and constant way and we want them never to change. It sounds tempting, but I think if we look at anxiety and insecurity as a basis for introverted fixation or fixating of any kind, that it falls short because it's regressive. We have to ask, well, why is somebody insecure? And you're starting back into a chain of whys. One could also say, from a theological point of view, that getting typed or getting fixed or getting stuck spiritually could be the consequence of taking a divinely disobedient attitude. Like we're not going to be the subjects of the gods. We're not going to follow and be obedient. And so we have set ourselves, in fact, we've even put ourselves into a cosmic exile or into a cosmic quarantine. And that by setting ourselves, by saying, no, we're not going to obey and do things your way, we're going to do it our own way. That's also answers to Faust and Mephistopheles. But unfortunately, that is also regressive. You have to ask yourself the question, well, why are we disobedient? So both of these answers are not real answers because they don't get to the root of problems. However, both insecurity and stubbornly ignoring cosmic reality, which is what our divine disobedience is, so both anxiety, insecurity, and disobedience and ignorance are ruled by Saturn. And I think we're looking in the right direction to find the source of getting fixed, so that we. I hope you realize that what I'm trying to get at this is meant to be practical mysticism, and we're going to get to that eventually. My own view, and I have never found any contradiction from any other mystical source. The main reason that we get stuck or that we fix ourselves is selfishness. Somehow, as we unfold our free will, we exercise our divine prerogative to do just what we want to do. And if that means blocking out the rest of the cosmos in ignorance, we do that. And if that results in insecurity from not being connected with the divine, we live with that. And we take the anxiety to control and manipulate the world more and more. It is our own personal variety of being spiritually arbitrary. I'm going to love the external world because I feel comfortable there and I like it there. And once we have established that personal arbitrariety, that statement of will that we can ignore, or that we can stonewall, or that we can manipulate, some of us find it much more pleasant to selfishly and willfully be focused inward and ignore the things like the cold weather outside and stay in that inner state. So, we have chosen part of the divine work, one of the states that we evolve through, and we have set ourselves in it, and we have generally brought fixity to our entire existence. And in some ways, we've got it pretty nice here, because the gods can't work on us directly. They can work on us indirectly through astrological influence or through other ways of working into the world. But we're in this isolation, in this quarantine. We feel we've got it pretty nice, and we identify ourselves with that. So, what we're doing is we're pretty close to stating that our fallen state is a general case of persistent fixation on something external. And it means then that to some extent, even though there are personality types that vary from life to life as introverts and extroverts, all of humanity is in a drastically extroverted state. I would say that that's probably why there isn't a week that goes by. I do a lot of counseling and I interact with a lot of people. There isn't a week that goes by that I'm not running into more and more and more severely depressed people. And usually depression is to bring us to go deeper and deeper into our own being. And I think it's because of the materialism, the very shallow materialism, that we are suffering depression. That will force us inward until we get to what we need to get to. If it is true that we are all, as humanity, are all roughly tight, then the same things that are necessary to reform or to correct individual fixations are true on a large humanity-wide scale. And that means extreme conditions for humanity. It means enormous suffering for humanity. Leontes, with all of his suffering as a consequence of having killed his own family, or thinking he killed all of his own family by his actions, if it took that to shock him out of it, it seems pretty clear that in our pathological removal from spiritual reality, it means enormous suffering is necessary to change us or for us to be reformed. In all of this, the way I'm talking, it's pretty clear that I'm stating that I think reform is indeed possible. That change is indeed possible. From a spiritual point of view, anything that can be made can be unmade. Anything that can be conceived can be accomplished. And so even something as great as a fixated type or an entire misfocus of humanity on materialistic extreme is capable of change. So Jung would say, you probably can't change the type, but you can change the sickness that may be associated with it. Whereas a mystic would say, ask whatsoever ye will, and it will be granted unto you. This means that anything we can see, anything we can take note of in our being, we can change and convert into something else. This is why in every form of the mysteries known, know thyself was always a fundamental part of it. If we can see errors that we make, if we can see misbehavior, if we can see sins, just the seeing of it alone sometimes is enough to promote the change that we need to make. Now, Carl Jung would probably say that a type would be a matter of genetics or of character being formed in early childhood development. Freud would probably say it's a combination of both because he was a Lamarckian and he believed that genetics were even changed by conditions in the world. In fact, Lamarckianism has some chance of coming back. If it does, then magic is open to everything. Those experiments of Rupert Sheldrake, if they prove positive, could change the whole notion of changing all evolution, plant, animal, and human evolution, without having to resort to gene manipulation. But at any rate, a mystic who would have a greater view, a much wider panorama that took into account several lives and several rebirths, not being so limited, would state that character definitely is changeable. This is one of the problems of materialism. Materialism can only see what is here now, which is basically the consequences. And it is not in touch with the realms of causes. And because of that, it's not only subject to a very uncertain world where the next replication may be changed, it is a world that is dealing basically with the husks of dead forms and not with the live creative power. So there's a big, big difference in outlook. Even without clairvoyant vision or the ability to see several lives, if we once take into account that more eternal perspective that accommodates several successive rebirths, we can deduce, even without clairvoyance, that types must be changeable. If they weren't, and people continued once set in a type, forever set in a type, people would be becoming more and more and more differentiated from each other, and there would be no hope that the Babel, where we don't even speak each other's languages, that a common communication or a universal understanding of any kind would not be possible if types typing couldn't be ameliorated or limited to some extent or changed. So anything can be changed. Why not now? The material scientists might say, they might even agree with this. To some extent, they would say that evolution is a constant matter of adapting and changing to a never-repeating environment. However, not even to their own satisfaction have they come up with a healthy relationship between genetics and evolutionary change. They have some problems there. All right. With that awareness that we can change, we can look at Bill's hypothesis that no, this character hadn't changed and that change is not really possible. We can say that character does indeed change. But now we have to understand what causes changes And how do we know when changes have taken place? All of us, I believe, have experienced some forms of change. Now, for a little while, we're not going to be speaking about psychology, Jungian or Freudian or any other kind. We're going to talk about experiences that all of us have had. When we speak of change, we're not only speaking about psychological change. We're talking about any kind of change in character, whether it be sudden change or gradual change or developmental and growing change, or whether it's something like an illness or a degeneration or the taking on of a new bad habit. So there are different rates and different kinds of change. In fact, it's even safe to say that most of the change in our lives is not completely wakingly self-conscious and deliberate. The greatest amount of change in our life appears to take place first below the threshold of waking, deliberate consciousness. This would agree with what the psychologists say. Both Freud and Jung would agree, and they would say, yes, most change does come from the unconscious. However, they would, in their materialism, they were locked in that materialistic perspective, and they didn't believe that we could go into the unconscious. As mystics, we believe that we can bring our waking self-consciousness into what is now the unconscious. However, to do so means a radical change in how we experience consciousness. One cannot see God with the same eyes with which one sees a cow. And so we have to look at the inner world, those that are now unconscious to us, in a way that is much different than the way that we look at the material world. Mysticism, or mystics, all have claimed what is the sphere of our waking consciousness, what we are aware of, what we can deliberately see and take note of and change, is a very small island. It is an extremely small island within a much greater unconscious or currently unconscious. Even though right now, for most of us, we're not aware of what is called the unconscious, that doesn't mean that it isn't, to some extent, awake and aware. It's just that we haven't learned to put our focus there, that we ignore that kind of consciousness in ourselves. I don't know how to say it. Well, we'll come to that in a little bit. For example, some people believe that our waking self-conscious is limited and can never change from the way we experience it now. Carl Jung, for example, when he went to India, he argued with the Brahmins, and he said there's no way that one can have waking consciousness beyond the realm of selfhood. That is not possible. The funny thing is that almost every Buddhist and most Hindus and Christians would say that that's where consciousness really begins, and that anything beneath that kind of consciousness is rather shadowy. The island that we have of waking self-consciousness is very, very precious to us. The need to awaken it as precious as it is to us, we understand a need to awaken to something beyond it, because we're aware of another consciousness, and we're aware of it in ways that are make it very desirable to us. We often sense that there is, especially in a creative activity, that there is a larger purpose behind what we're doing, and that purpose works its way into this little island of waking consciousness, almost the way a chicken lays an egg and hatches it. It's like ideas are born to us whole. We're not even aware of the hatching or the incubation process. It sometimes feels like we're in some synchronistic relationship to a bigger world in which we have no causal powers that runs parallel to this, and that sometimes we are blessed by eggs dropped from that world. Beethoven said of that, he said it's something to the effect of, in every creative work there is something that goes beyond the creator. What we need to realize is that that is a misperception. That is a misperception that is founded in the surety and the dependence and the holding on to this little island of waking self-consciousness that we have. The reality is that that spiritual, creative world with the greater universal understanding that is the source of all those miraculous things is right within us. And that is our true nature. And this conception that we have of ourselves as petty heroes or big fish in a very little pond is an incorrect illusion. The real trick is to awaken to that other kind of consciousness. This is what reform is really about. And to literally be God. And this is why we work studiously on doing different kinds of spiritual exercises. It becomes frustrating because we know there's a different way of grasping things other than the way we grasp it now. And every once in a while we get a little taste. But if we continue with those things, the hope is that we will come to that kind of consciousness. Looking at change from the viewpoint of the material evolutionist thinks that all change is merely a response to something outside of us, and that even what we think is our internal consciousness is a consequence of different chemical interactions that come from without. And it's all of our inwardness is just an illusion, just an effect of something inward. So we can see that there is a source for change. And that's what we're trying to get to. It seems to me that there are two kinds of changes, and they probably work together with each other. One is a very sudden type of change, like the change the aunties underwent, and the other kind of change is a very slow, gradual change. We've all experienced very gradual changes. For example, we've gone through the slow, deliberate process of learning a musical instrument or of developing a new habit. We may not have been completely conscious in that process. We learned to do the different fingerings and to hear the different sounds and to sense the different harmonies, but we weren't conscious of the fact that we were developing new neuromuscular associations, and that took a while. So it isn't a completely consciousness, but a good part of it is. We also, on a regular basis, go through unconscious processes of change. We're doing so right now. We're adjusting or adapting to a new season, and we're not aware of it. And come next spring, we'll realize that we have to adapt all over again to warming conditions. And we're not fully aware of that. Most of those things are very slow. Sometimes adapting to a social climate is the same thing. Or healing a wound is the same thing. We don't know that we're not watching it cell by cell, and we don't go through the whole process of, breaking the fluids into a wound and then putting stringy tissue through there. We're not conscious of that all the way through. So we're aware sometimes that we're changing, but not how we're doing it and why we're doing it in all. Our entire evolution is a slow learning, awakening, and changing process. Even our chosen spiritual path. I hope this isn't too boring. It is all, I understand, all convolution. It's all talking to myself and having nothing to do or little to do at this point with Shakespeare. When we choose a spiritual path and we deliberately put everything of our spiritual capacity to bear on the process of waking up, when our will and our full attention is directed to it, we accelerate the process of change and we accelerate the growing up, the evolution. That's true in theory, at least, though sometimes it seems like it doesn't happen that quickly. Sometimes it actually seems that people who are not even conscious of the fact that they are in a spiritual evolution seem to grow more swiftly than we do, because they're not having to fight themselves every step of the way. They're not having to deal with that ego consciousness that hangs on to this way of living. But eventually, at some time, if we are to reach that higher kind of consciousness, everyone is going to have to do that. Sometime or another, we have to deal with the problem of awkwardness and selfishly keeping our attention where we want to keep it. All of us are very much aware of the whole process of trying to wake up and the exercises that we do or that we utilize to do so. There is a tremendous frustration in that with using everything that we have to keep our attention on the subject of something, we get drawn away. We get pulled off. We get in the way of ourselves. And it's almost as if there were something that's trying to distract us, and something that's trying to keep our attention from being directed to a kind of consciousness that is different than the kind of consciousness that we have in this lovely, clear, bright, pellucid little island of being awake. Some people actually even believe that there are demons and devils out there that are trying to nip and grab at our soul and keep us from what they would say enjoying the kingdom. That may be, but the real problem is that it is within us, that the desire to not change and to stay just as we are is a selfish, perhaps demonic desire that comes from our own petty little selves. I don't want to get too far from my notes here because they're I'll be sure to get lost. Our selfhood, as we conceive of it in our small egoistic little way, has come to identify with this little island of consciousness. So even when we strive to get beyond egoism, our own selfhood vigorously resists. And despite all of our proclamations and every bit of evidence, even any little scintilla of evidence that we are anything but divine, we reject again and again because we want to hang on to what we are. If we wish to have transcendent waking consciousness, we have to be willing to sacrifice even this island of self-consciousness. We have to give up what we now consider a weakness, because this consciousness, as we see it now, is so thoroughly permeated and divine and defined by egoism that our identity is locked up in it in such a way that we cannot see something greater. So what is our waking consciousness must be sacrificed, must be given up if we want to awaken to real consciousness. Anything short of that, any little glimpse that we get of a higher or another consciousness can be taken into this consciousness, and it gets co-opted and it gets compromised, and our egoism becomes all the more vainglorious. We become all the more exaggerated in our conception of ourselves. I believe that this is what is behind the superstition of never seeing the bride before the wedding or before the actual marriage itself. Because if we get little glimpses of what's in store for us, we will arrogate them to our egoism, and our egoism will have all the more reason with all of its convincing arguments of why we should stay just as we are, and that it is foolish claptrap to think of sacrificing the kind of consciousness that we have now. It's a fearsome thing to think of giving up our consciousness as it is now. It's a very fearsome thing. It's like there's a fear of self dying, an ego death, or something like that. Even the hints that we get of the glories of the Spirit and its eternality, which are always awing to us, and even when we see people around us who have given up this smaller consciousness and are none the worse for it, they still have personal responsibilities, they still have the same personal vehicles to work with, but they work with from a much different kind of consciousness, despite both of those evidences of intuitions or sensing of a higher consciousness, and the examples that we have of great saints and mystics that are before us, we still balk at it. We still hesitate. And probably, at least from what I have discerned from mysticisms that I've looked at, ancient and modern, East and West, the only thing that can get us out of being locked in our little island of consciousness is love. That we have to learn to love and care for something beyond us, that everything we do, every thought, every desire, every action, every material experience that we have, we do it for that sake. We do it out of love. And that is the only thing that can get us beyond the kind of egoism that we have. When we can love the one spirit to the sacrifice of a personal ego, that's when we're on the way. What often happens then is that we consider to ourselves how little we love and how unequipped we are for actually entering into divinity. But that's just another perception of the mind. There's some realization and there's some knowledge in it, but it shows that even the mind is like the crown jewel of this little island. It's the thing that we take as our, as our prized possession. That the mind is where we have our greatest waking consciousness. And it is the mind that is in the hands of this egoistic consciousness. So, we have to, one way or another, be brought to change our focus and to love, and love that which can only bring us through things. So we're talking about drastic things, drastic matters of great consequence are what are required to make great changes, great reformations. Whether it's a big meteor coming smashing into the earth and killing all the dinosaurs and the conditions for dinosaurs, or whether it is building up in a Zen monastery a greater and greater and greater tension until finally, in one drastic instance, something like breaking a leg or something like that, you suddenly snap and see through and have a satori experience. Or sometimes you kill your wife and children. And it leads to a sudden realization of just what you are, and you let go of it. From astrology, we know that the planet that indicates sudden awakenings, creativity, and liberation, altruism, also indicates great shocks, sudden events. Some of them are called accidents. I have, and I'm sure that every one of you have, experienced slow, deliberate changes and sudden changes. Some small, some very great, such that one day we're one way and then we have a shocking experience, and the next day we can't possibly ever go back to the way we lived before. I think all of us has had that. I do a lot of counseling with people. I talked to a man once who was right in the heart of Vietnam, and he said, one day I was an ordinary guy, and then I saw my best friend killed right in front of me. And he said, I went into a bloodlust rage. He said, I'm going to use a nasty word, but he said, I killed every gook I could see. Didn't make any difference whether they were North Vietnamese or South Vietnamese. And after I calmed down, I was never the same person again. And he's now lives off in a house trailer all alone by himself. And he's about as meek and as mild of an individual as you can see. I've had a number of friends that had sudden changes. I've had several friends that have had abortions. And when they realized what they did, their life was forever changed, and they were never the same again, and they became as fine of human beings as you can imagine. These sudden changes usually give us our consciousness is so changed that everything that we do thereafter, we ruminate on those moments, whether they be spiritual experiences like St. Paul's or killing a number of Vietnamese. In either case, it gives us a lot to think on. And if we ruminate on that successfully with all of our faculties, that is where the real growth and reformation takes place. It's just like an evolution. There are great sudden changes, cataclysms, and then there's a slow, gradual evolutionary change. This is a homage to Carlos Castaneda. It is a wonderful thing that he did. If you read the books of Carlos Castaneda, from the earliest ones to the latest ones, the early ones are filled with all kinds of phenomena. Drug phenomena, psychic phenomena, magic phenomena. And what he does, as he progresses in life, he goes back to all of these sudden, remarkable changes. And each time he goes back to them, something else is brought out so that the phenomena aren't even considered much anymore. And it is what the character of he is and what he sees in the character of the people around him. It is that way that real reformation takes place. So, Bill is correct in saying that it is very hard to make a significant change in our character. But it does happen, and when it does happen, it often has to be first with a radical event and then with a denouement where one unfolds everything that was in that moment. The ideal is if we slowly build up to an event like that, which we ourselves can't precipitate except if we do it as Leontes did, and then to follow the gradual decline from that high point and to be perpetually having new build-ups, events, and declines. That's a pretty ideal life, and that's quite a bit to expect. One of the reasons that making real change and reforming our character is so hard is because we have illusions in our consciousness. In this small island of consciousness, we think that the way it is now, it always has been, and it always will be. And even if we work toward reform, we think of reform as just having new habits, but being just as we are now, which is not the way it is. We have to become different people. Behavior doesn't change. Character has to change. And our whole way of looking at things has to change if any of the things that we are unhappy with in our own being now are to be changed at all. So, we have briefly seen that real change is possible and that it is difficult due to internal resistance. Even more briefly, we have looked at different rates of change and a little bit of the rationale for each. We have seen that the drastic acts of Leontes, born of extreme introversion, were sufficient to provoke a sudden change. Manifestations of spiritual truth in events like this are almost ironic. It's almost as if his sickness forced the hand, or was like a prayer, to be changed. We always put ourselves in a fix when we need to change. We put ourselves in an impossible position so that something drastic has to be done. And so to get beyond the island of consciousness that we have now, we have to go really way out on a limb. I'm not saying doing something foolish, and I'm not saying, anything wacky like that, but really go out on a limb. Obviously, not every case of homicide is justified. And not every case of homicide results in a reformation, or our prisons would be filled with saints, or saints in the making. And where that may be so in a few cases, it isn't so in all cases. It means that drastic events are not enough on their own. It means that there has to be some kind of work. We have to be cooperating and participating in the process of life and change for that to take place. The question is Leontes such an individual? Is he somebody that has indeed made the change? Has he cooperated and made the change, or is this some new self-delusion where he has found a new trick to cover up for a type of character that wants to persist in its own way? Stated another way, how do we know if we have really changed and if we have really reformed? It's not a really easy matter, and I'll give you a somewhat self-embarrassing example to show you some of the difficulty. As most of you probably know, I am someone who aspires to the ideals of chastity and celibacy and generative purity. Celibacy being the abstention from sexual activity to conserve the creative energy to be used in divine service, to be used with love for that beyond. Chastity is an attitude. Chastity is a reverent loving of the power of that and of the purity of it. It's not something that one can fake. Generative purity is when one lives in such a way that they are both chaste and celibate, and they do use the sexual energy when it is necessary for procreation. They are not easy ideals, even when one is, by a personal evolution, ready to try to live them. The fact that almost everybody in this room, and surely everybody in this room, knows that I have this aspiration is pretty good evidence of why I am not ready. If you have to spend all of your time talking about your ideals, it's an evidence of insecurity, and it's a waste of energy, and it certainly distracts you from the ideal itself. That not readiness, or not complete unreadiness, has been evidenced to me at numerous times in life when I have been conjugal and have shared an intimate life socially and physically with lovers and partners. I had an enormous amount of social growth to go through, and I had a lot of things to learn. And some of my expressions of sexuality were certainly not chaste, and it was as though my indulgences led me into lessons that I would not have entered in with the selfishness of my mind. I can remember one of the early experiences in all of this, because it pertains perfectly to the topic. After a period of a number of years of abstinence, I had a lover. And after our first conjugal experience, I was filled with guilt. Not merely healthy remorse, but guilt, which indicates more unreadiness. And it bothered me for a long, long time, weeks. And having failed before my ideal, I was wanting to redeem myself. It's kind of funny, but I was dithering and I was immature in my being, and I was thinking, well, how long am I going to have to be abstinent before I can consider myself celibate again? It's really, it showed the lack of concern I had for my partner. It showed a lack of understanding I had about celibacy and an utter disregard for chastity. It was pretty ridiculous. Celibacy isn't something that can be measured in time. And it's not something that can be understood necessarily through mental process. Celibacy and chastity are a matter of life. They're a matter of how we live, the spirit in which we live. At the heart of life, in the life spirit, we draw intuition. And intuition flows into us, or it sparks into us, and we know how to live and when we're living right. It's a constant way of living. It is like the primordial word that is constantly speaking itself. And it's not like the words of Hamlet, which are that kind of dithering thing. Being able to be in the Spirit is a matter of degree. But once we live the life of the Spirit, or to the degree we live the life of the Spirit, life is the answer itself. We don't need to question. Questions don't even come to our mind. To the degree that I can live in chastity, that I live in the spirit of it. It's not a matter of time, because all of us in our past lives have at least once been sexual. And having once been sexual, we're in the same position as the scientist. If we try to measure it in time, we don't know whether the next replication of the law of nature is going to apply or not. It may not be. There's always that kind of uncertainty. Once is enough to indict us if we did it selfishly, and we are condemned if we live by a life of induction. What we need to do is to live in eternity, in a nowness that never ends and is always reproducing itself. So it's probably better, whether we are or not immediately sexual, just to admit that we sin or have sinned by abusing the divine creative force, and accept that in humility, which is probably a pretty good way to get out of the island of ego, and then we can live in the Spirit. Because a state of life is not mentally determinable in the final analysis, doesn't mean that we shouldn't use the mind to serve the intuition, or for the intuition to reflect back to itself. The mind can be very trustworthy in service, not service of ourself in this little island that we live in, but the service for something that understands the truth that the mind really wants to know. Psychology is a very good vehicle to aid the intuition and to come to a true understanding. In the case of looking at characters in Shakespeare, it's very difficult because we're working with an artificial character. And we first have to judge whether Shakespeare has been correct or capable of producing a valid psychological character. And then we can see whether that character has been reformed or not. We don't have the luxury of direct observation or the direct experience of another character, but we can even be lulled by that. We have people around us every day that we see and whose character we really don't understand. Last night I went to Verona for a woman who was shut in with her little boy and couldn't get to the store, and we worked on her chart. And it wasn't until several hours after I got home that I realized that I didn't read what was going on in the character. I accepted her at her word, and I accepted her behavior and experience as it was externally, and I didn't look at the psychology behind the atomacy of some of her things. So we can be lulled to sleep by thinking we know people that we see every day. But at any rate, whether we have an artificial character or whether we have somebody that is around us, if we do look into the character, we can determine what is going on. When we look at life, there is not a register, there's not a legend that tells us whether that life is healthy or not healthy. All we can do is look at what they do and what they don't do. And by observing what they do and what they don't do, we can penetrate and with the aid of psychology begin to understand how that life is functioning, whether it is sick or whether it is not, or whether it is reformed or whether it is the same. So that's what I did. I went back to it all over again with Leontes, and I looked at what he did and what he didn't do. What he didn't do immediately after and distantly after the radical experience at the trial, when it is announced to him that his son has died and he has already condemned his daughter to be exposed for death, and his wife has passed out and he thinks she is dead, immediately thereafter, what he doesn't do is speak with convoluted language. He no longer speaks with all sorts of gargoyle fantasies as he did, especially in the first act. All the way through to the end of the play, he does not do what one would expect from a pathological introvert. So that argues in favor of reform. What he does do, especially in the last scene, is he observes and he observes intently. When he's looking at the statue of Hermione, he's looking very carefully and he's noting every little detail. But he's not using it to reinforce prejudices. He's not using it to reinforce the psychological scenario that he has built in himself. He's looking at it for the object itself. So what he is doing argues in favor of a degree of healthy extroversion, that he has come out of himself and that he is looking at other things. Moreover, seeing Polixenes and Hermione in the same room in a very charged situation, there is not the least little bit of jealousy. This also argues in favor of reform. He has also gone through, not to the degree that Carlos Castaneda did, but he has also gone through a slow unwinding of the events and a mulling over and digesting the experience he has had, whereas before the event everything was an open and shut case. So this also argues in terms of reform. However, he does still seem to steep himself in remorse, and he still does seem to go back somewhat to the issue, so I would suspect that he is not completely reformed. He still talks about the old mistakes he made, but that's less serious, because that's a stage that you always go through. I remember that for a pretty long time after I quit smoking pot, and I would never smoke pot again. I would still go back and talk about smoking pot. So the talking is sometimes a way of relieving the last little bit of anxiety you have about something. So since jealousy and Saturn manifestations are responsible, are introvertive qualities, and Saturnine conditions are exceedingly hard to change compared to something like excitability or gossip or something like that. Bill was probably right in saying that you have to be extremely wary about whether somebody has changed or not. But I guess my assessment is that there are both positive and negative indicators that would claim that there is change, and change of the kind that we would like to make in our lives, but that there are a few last little vestiges that are not there. I'll have to give Bill a tape of the talk, and he may want to come back with another statement, and if so, he can have the last word. I've had too many last words in my life. That's about it for now. I'm ready now to move on to Julius Caesar, and it'll be on February 10th before we get to do so. I hope you don't take this as too much of an indulgence, but these are matters that are very, very important to me, and I hope to everybody else, because I hope that's what we're all trying to do. Questions? Yeah.
I was thinking early on that that's one of the enjoyable things about these late plays, that at the end we do feel the hopefulness of change.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
It doesn't matter if you believe it makes sense.
Yep. Yep.
You just delight the real nobility.
Yes. Yeah, I think that the tragicomedy indicated in Shakespeare a very big step forward in growth. And from what you're saying, I think that your arguments at the end, the observation
about love being
Yes.
and I was playing in my mind. I was very sleepy at the beginning, and I couldn't play much, and I couldn't enter into a lot of what you're saying. But the experience of that kind of love, you can't separate it out from the humble, respectful, observing of whatever it is. You know, it can be human life. Yeah, I mean, the old, you ask old people, long married people, what's the secret? And usually it's respect. And it is respect. But that respect, it can be a superficial thing, but it comes from really seeing.
Yes.
And humble. And that really seeing comes from a humble observing, a loving observing.
Yes.
So it's all in plan. And so I take that argument very strongly.
My experience of it is that when I love, it really relieves me. And on the other direction, it's really painful when I get involved with self-love and vanity. It's almost as if I'm painting myself with an invisible lacquer brush or something like that. I feel suffocated, and it's actually a painful experience. And I almost wonder if one of the motivations of vanity and egoism isn't some kind of masochism, that we're playing God with ourselves and, like revving ourselves and giving ourselves more strength by the pain of self-love.
I would go first to that you're setting yourself up for Christ.
Yeah. 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 And you paint enough lacquer on, it starts to crack. Well, I hope everybody has good holidays. You guys going to come Sunday? Great.
Open this weekend?
Yes, all weekend.
Lady like this.